FreeMMOStation.com.
Hey guys, I'm Skyline Shore with FreeMMOStation, and as you guys know, I have been covering the Guild Wars 2 stuff lately, because it has gone free to play, and this video is going to be about dungeons. So yeah, it's a little bit of a rehash, but I want to really talk about kind of like, almost like a review style of a couple of dungeons here. I have been having a lot of fun with Guild Wars 2, it's my most played MMO currently, and probably of all time at the moment, though I've had some fun with Terra. I think Terra dungeons are incredibly exciting, you know, of course, because its base mechanics are so fun, but it's really the overall dungeon design. You know, we're not even contemplating the actual mechanics of the game. We're just looking at the raw dungeon design. And overall, Guild Wars 2 has really interesting dungeon design. However, it is easily exploited because of, you know, poor AI and stuff like that. But I can honestly say, as a boxed game, as a buy-to-play game, the dungeon and the campaign experience because of the dungeoneering was really exciting, really fun. It just doesn't have that hyper replayability that you might want in raiding. Of course, we are getting raiding, and that's going to be the new focus with the expanded content, but what we're talking about here is dungeons. These are going to be instances where that I mean, they're essentially dungeons. Some of them are literal dungeons. Most of them actually are literal dungeons. But they are instanced areas. You go in with 5 people, and you complete a story mode. That's pretty cool. You know, it's tied in directly with your campaign, your personal story, and the living story. And, you know, overall, you get a really interesting feel for the current world as well as the past lore. But once you complete the story mode, it kind of gets you ready. It's almost like a tutorial, almost. It gets you ready for the paths. And the path system, I think more games should do this, but it basically works like this. You start the dungeon, and then you get to a point very early on, like 30 seconds into the dungeon, you are asked to choose a path. And every dungeon has 3 paths, except for one. One has an extra path that was added on due to Living Story, and that's like the hardest dungeon path ever, and it's my favorite. No spoiler, Reno, I'm not even going to give you any hints or anything, but anyways, guys, so you choose a path, and you have to vote between your group. Normally, when you're looking for group, you kind of state what path you want to do, if you're going to do multiple or just one. So you choose 1, 2, or 3, and you get this little story explanation of what's happening, but essentially the dungeon is broken up into 3 different parts. When you play the story mode, it is wholly different than these parts, and each of these individual paths are very different. They might share 1 or 2 bosses at most, or like little events, but for the most part, each of these 3 little paths act as a wholly different dungeon. It's just kind of like in the same setting. If you guys understand what I'm saying. Like in World of Warcraft, you don't really see that stuff until like very, very later on, where you have a dungeon that actually has multiple paths. So Guild Wars 2, right from the get-go, your very first dungeon, you have multiple paths that you can choose from and branch out and do. And you're going to want to do that. You want to do, like, if you're farming for gold, and this is a very popular thing to do, you get level 80, you get your really good gear, and maybe you're looking to get more gold, maybe to craft that legendary, right? The most popular thing to do is farm dungeons for gold. So what we want to do is you do 1 path a day, like each path a day. So let's say Ascalonian Catacombs is like the very first dungeon that you get acquainted with. It's also really fun, in my personal opinion. And so most people will do path 1 and path 3 because they're done really easily. You can just zerg them down. You don't really need to think too much. Now, path 2 is actually pretty difficult, and it takes a lot of teamwork. So yeah, they do path 1 and path 3. You don't want to repeat paths because whenever you complete a path, you actually get a bonus gold for completing it for that day. So yeah, you want to do like each path once. Path 1, path 3, and you want to figure out different paths that you want to complete. But it's really important to complete each path, each story mode, each dungeon. You want to complete all the dungeons at least 1 time so you get the achievement. And, you know, getting achievement points is really good because you get really cool cosmetics and stuff, man. It's also just really fun, really rewarding. You get to learn about the story. You get to experience some really unique mechanics. Honestly, playing these dungeons for the very first time, as a new player, it just feels infinitely rewarding. Like me, I played Dark Souls, right? I mean, what dungeon could be better than Dark Souls? And honestly, some of these dungeons were incredibly difficult, even as a 5-man. There are just some mechanics that you have to learn. Of course, once you learn the mechanics, you can completely abuse them and it becomes broken. So it's all about memorization, you know? Same thing with Dark Souls. Like, if you're a good player at Dark Souls, it's literally a walk in the park. However, to new players, it seems like the most impossible game ever, and that's how Guild Wars 2 is. When you're leveling up and you're going through this experience, that's open world content as well, but as you're doing these dungeons, right, it's going to seem really, really hard probably, but don't worry, it's really, you got to learn the mechanics, and then boom, instantaneously, it's going to be very easy, which is, it's kind of bad for Endgame, right? For the learning, the leveling experience, it's awesome. You know, experiencing all these different dungeons and leveling up, it's awesome. But since dungeons, or like raiding, is normally the Endgame, and since Guild Wars 2 didn't have a technical raiding, it was actually really grindy. You know, once you learn these mechanics, you know when to dodge, where to go really quickly, who to like skip, you know, bosses, sometimes a skip, where to stack. You know, it becomes really trivial. So the endgame content wasn't actually that good. However, with the expansion, of course, that's going to be resolved. But another way to sort of resolve or ease the endgame experience, make it not so repetitious, or like actually, I mean, it's still repetitious, but to make it not so dull, they added in this thing called the Mists. Or technically, it's called Fractals of the Mist. And this is actually a really awesome concept that I hope they elaborate on for some of the missed out seasonal events and one-time events that, you know, new players won't be able to experience at all. It'd be kind of cool if we can go back in time. But basically, I'm not going to give you a huge lore rundown, but real quick, basically what the Mists are is sort of like this like phantasmal, misty kind of area, and it's like sort of like the past is echoing around constantly, like in this ethereal sort of cloud area thing, whatever, magic and shit. So the past is constantly echoing around, and you as a player, the Asurans actually have gotten this technology so that they can actually go and see and interact with the past. Well, not like change the past, but you can just sort of like relive the past, and that's how the Mist works. So you go into the Fractals of the Mist through these portals, these Asura gates, and you get to go experience some of the giant world-shaping events that you kind of hear about as you level up, as you go through these dungeons. And sometimes you go see them, like there's a place called the Thermonova Reactor, and it's like this reactor, it was like nuclear, it was supposed to like harness dragon energy, and it's all destroyed and broken and stuff, and this is actually an open world area, and there's like some big events there. So as you're leveling up, you see that place, and you kind of wonder like what the past is, and as you do that open world area there, you kind of learn a little about it, but you don't really learn exactly what happened. That's when you get to level 80, you go into the Fractal of the Mist, and there is a randomly generated fractal that, boom, you are back into the Thermonova Reactor, and you get to see exactly what happened. You truly get to experience it, and that single instance is like my favorite. It happened to be my first Fractal of the Mist dungeon that I did, and it almost made me throw up. Like, there's some seriously graphic shit that goes on. It's really intense. It makes you really think about the world of Guild Wars, and that's what the Fractals really does. It allows them to make dungeons that aren't really set in stone, like literally, like they're like floating around. It's kind of broken up too. Like sometimes the mists, they aren't quite accurate. Like you're not seeing the proceeding of the history, right? You're not seeing it happen exactly as it did. There's some things that can be kind of convoluted, you know, wibbly wobbly, timey wimey. So as you're going through this mist, it's like sort of you have a randomly generated progression of different dungeons. So one, you might do the Thermonova Reactor first, or maybe it's second, or maybe it's third, or maybe you don't do it at all. You do some entirely different dungeons. Like you got to go do the like you got to kill like the giant jade eyeball monster thing with tentacles and craziness. Most of the time it ends in some big giant climactic battle with a boss or lots and lots of hordes of enemies. But overall, you're gonna find that the Fractals of the Mist is just like the dungeons, except not as sort of like, you know, set in stone. Everything happens so much more faster, with a much bigger spectacle as well, and overall it's significantly more hectic. So the Fractals of the Mist is sort of Guild Wars 2 Endgame, and it's meant to be played over and over and over again. However, they have a ascended sort of thing going on here. You need ascended items, and you need to equip them with some things called agonies, and this allows you to be impervious or be slightly immune in ways to this thing called agony, which I guess does damage over time. I haven't really experienced it too much because I'm not a fan of repetitious content, so I just kind of play the level 1 agony zones stuff for like tier 1. Yeah, if I'm not making much sense to you, it's because, honestly, the system is kind of convoluted, and it was sort of just like a shoehorned way to make Endgame. But basically, the Fractals of the Mist is like an expansion of the dungeon system. Instead of going through an instance and then travel across the world, go through another instance in the path system, you have randomly generated paths, essentially, for you. But I can say that the Fractals of the Mist dungeons are really just as exciting, especially if it's your first time playing them. You might even fail, like you might not be able to complete them. They're very very, very challenging. And what's very interesting about these, which is dissimilar to the normal dungeons, is that you have these challenges that it's not just about tanking and spanking, it's not about just dodging at the right time all the time. Some of the fractals are a little bit easier than others, but most of the time you have these environmental effects, and that's the real big important thing. You have all these like different little puzzles that involve the environment in some way. Like there's one where you are underwater and you need to stay near a light source, or else you'll be eaten alive by what I'm assuming is like a tiny krill or something. I don't know. You basically, you'll die. So you need to jump from light to light. It kind of reminds me of a Gears of War segment with the monster called the krill, so it kind of makes sense. There's another one where you have to go from bonfire to bonfire, and you have to do it quickly, or else you're going to freeze to death. And if you freeze to death, then GG. Some mist areas have like multiple puzzles with them, like the Thermonova reactor. You have to do one puzzle where you have to DPS down a blob before he can revive himself with other blobs, and then you have to go into like a maze area with a shield, and you have to block laser beams in a correct order and try not to die, and you have to use teamwork. Sometimes you have to activate different activations at the same time as teammates, so yeah, requires teamwork and stuff. And, you know, sometimes it's pretty usual. You see a boss, you kill the boss, but then maybe there's some weird, unique mechanic. Now, one of my favorite mist dungeons is one where you have to actually release a titan or something like that. You have to actually break apart shackles and then run up this, like, monument, and there's, like, these occultists that are keeping this entity, you know, sealed away, and so you're killing the cultists and you're trying to break down the shackles. However, one unique mechanic, not only is the jumping puzzles and killing them and fighting them because they keep respawning, not only that, I guess it's challenging in itself, but ArenaNet added the extra challenge of whoever holds the hammer takes more and more damage over time. So as you pick up the hammer and you're holding it, what you need to actually, you know, break free from this guy from the shackles, you're doing tons and tons of damage to yourself. So a lot of the times, like, you have this sort of like pressing time. You have this huge pressure to complete your, at least the current activity, or just finish off the mist dungeon entirely, which I think is really fun. Like, overall, the game feeling is really, really interesting. Yeah, everything just feels like a little bit more dangerous, right? Because in these mist dungeons, a lot of them you can die just from, I don't know, just barely messing up. And a lot of people will yell at you and scream at you. Yeah, that's true. But overall, the base dungeons are really fun for a single experience. A little bit of replayability there, I think. A little bit. But for the most part, the mist dungeons have a little bit more replayability, I think, because they're a little bit more challenging, and mastering them and grinding through them is a little bit more fun, especially because you don't have the set paths. There is a little bit of randomization, but not too much. It's not too much terribly fun. It's probably not going to be as rewarding as raids coming out. So I'm just saying though, guys, even though I personally don't think that Guild Wars 2 has that much replayability with its dungeons and overall, I think that the first experience, you know, that learning curve, that first experience is completely worth. Like, absolutely like, when this game was buy to play, it was worth it, you know, because it actually felt like I guess you could say like a action RPG. And it truly does offer the RPG experience, the lore, the story, especially with the mists, even though it's not just force-fed to you like the campaign or the living story or anything like that in the game. It's so mysterious, right? It's almost Dark Soulsian. Like, you go to these weird-ass places that have had, like, no connection to the game so far, and it only is presenting new things. Like, oh my gosh, what is this? How does this relate to anything? And you start kind of having these theories worked up in your brain, and that's what I think is really awesome. Yeah, the dungeons are cool because they're like contemporary with the story and everything, but as the game is evolving, which it seems like it's evolving at a really fast pace, I'd like to see a little bit more with the fractals. I think that's a really awesome system. I'd like to see more fractals dungeons being implemented, and it seems like ArenaNet's not afraid to add in more dungeon paths as well, because they already have done that with the Aether path, with, I think it's called Twilight Arbor. So yeah, they added a new path in there, so they might change and make some older dungeons a little bit more replayable. They might add difficulties, stuff like that. We don't know. But what we do know is that, yes, the base dungeons are fun, and they're pretty easy to get into, so if you guys are leveling up right now, do the dungeons. Do them right now. Don't wait until endgame. I know open world is pretty okay, but the dungeons is really fun, man. But what we do know is that raids, later on, that's going to be your replay factor, and it's going to take everything that I think I'm gushing about, you know, with these really awesome environmental mechanics, the puzzles, stuff like that, the cooperative play that's necessary to complete these. They're going to take all those things that we like about the dungeons right now, and they're going to make it like 10 times better, and it's going to be harder and more competitive, and a little bit like better replay value with better rewards, hopefully, with raids. That's going to come out, but that's not the free-to-play component, of course, so can't really talk about that too much. But I honestly say that I had a lot of fun doing the dungeons. I played all of them multiple times in a row. That story, that's all the paths, and it really is. It really is truly fun. It's just not as replayable as the raids in World of Warcraft. However, we are getting raids, so I don't know. Keep bringing it back up, but it's kind of awkward to talk about FreeMMOStation, talking about something that's not free. I don't know. But I want to end this little ranting kind of video talking about dungeons and everything, talking about the classes and everything. Now, I'm sure you guys have some questions like, oh, what class should I play if I want to do dungeons? Well, like I said kind of at the start of the video, and I kind of like been reiterating, is that the dungeons, even the Fractals of the Mist, aren't really like competitive. I mean, they're difficult, yeah, but it's not like you have a set trinity or set classes that you need to play to accomplish these different objectives, these different dungeons. You really don't. It's really not as competitive as raiding as what maybe you're thinking of in World of Warcraft. Raiding, hugely competitive. There's some very strict requirements for a team or a raid composition. However, in Guild Wars 2, it's not really like that. If somebody is complaining that you're a necromancer, well, they can get over it. They're just biased and being toxic. Okay, you can play whatever you want, do whatever you want, just don't freaking suck. Like, if you know you're not doing good DPS, you should probably change to something that does good DPS, honestly. Like, that's basically the big thing, though. Like, whatever you're playing, just make sure you're doing damage. That's why everyone likes running Zerker. It's just kind of like this really easy thing to do. You do lots of big white numbers and big red numbers as well. So, yeah, it's important to do damage. Don't just go into a dungeon like thinking you're going to be a full healer, because that's not going to work, okay? Guild Wars 2 wasn't made in the way like World of Warcraft was. There isn't that holy trinity of classes. You don't have a healer, DPS, tank. It doesn't quite work like that. Basically, essentially, in my experience, and I'm pretty sure it's just how the game is made, everyone goes as big damage as possible, and everybody just dodges. So that's why it's kind of like Dark Souls in that sense. Like, you have to learn the dungeons. Yeah, you're probably going to get flamed. There is a bit of toxicity in Guild Wars 2. There honestly is. But it's a learning experience, and I think it's really fun. It's a really fun learning experience. Just shun people who are going to yell at you and stuff like that. If they kick you, then just please persist, play through these dungeons. They're a really awesome first-time experience. And I know, normally, free-to-play games tend to be repetitious. Guild Wars 2 is one of those games that truly feels like it was worthy of its buy-to-play title. It's fun the first time around, and especially if you play with friends, maybe a second time around, but I will say that it can actually get a bit repetitive. And this is actually probably in part due to how the game was designed. It's not like you can go into a dungeon and play a healer that time. It's not like you can go into a dungeon and play a tank that time. Pretty much everybody is playing this like weird pseudo role sometimes. Like you can be a puller, I guess. You pull a monster. I don't know. There's really not roles, man. Everyone just kind of lumps together. They stack together, and you just kind of mob around. It does get repetitive. It honestly does. That's my review. Even though I love this game, I'll gush about this game. I will say that the dungeons get repetitive. So that's my review of the dungeoneering in Guild Wars 2. Not talking about raids, but what I can say is that the future of dungeons, of Fractals of the Mist, which I count as dungeons, and as raids, I think the future is very bright. Whatever changes they make is only going to be better, as evidence of the living story dungeons that they did. And remember, guys, seasonal events do include some instance dungeoneering. Like, there are sometimes they're jumping puzzles, yes, but sometimes they're like the Halloween event where the labyrinth, where it was like this sort of like gauntlet where you had to run through this giant labyrinth with all these giant raid bosses. It was freaking amazing. Oh my gosh. Remember, guys, there are going to be living story and seasonal events that might have dungeons in them as well. But anyways, for the usual dungeons, they're pretty good. Play them, have fun with them, really enjoy the story. Don't skip the cinematics. Really dive into it. You're gonna, I think you're gonna find it worthwhile. I honestly believe so. At least that was my experience. So thanks for watching, guys. I'm Skelly Shore with FreeMMOStation, and I will continue to cover Guild Wars 2, at least for a little bit longer. Like I said earlier, can't really talk about the expansion because that costs money. Not free, not a free MMO, but whatever. Hope you guys are having fun. I know I am, and I will see you again next time.